legalisefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffitt, and my guest today is Thomas Sheridan, who joins me to discuss the history and evolution of alternative media, marking 10 years of Legalise Freedom. Hello and welcome, Thomas, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
It's great to be here, Greg, and well done on a decade in alt media. You're one of the few long-term survivors, and that's a fantastic thing. I'm delighted to be here and honoured to celebrate that phenomenal legacy with you.
Thank you so much. You were the first person I thought of, really, and as I said to you off air, I'm not really sentimental, but I thought April 1st, 2012 is when I went out with my first show. And so April 1st, 2022, I just thought I should at least mention the fact, Funnily enough, the first show I did was entitled World Economic Meltdown 2012. It was with a financial analyst called Alistair MacLeod. So a very dry topic, economics. And I was just reflecting on the fact at the time that the financial crisis, the big blow up, 2007, 2008, that the repercussions were still being felt, although that the mainstream were telling us that that was all over with. And it seems so tame now, considering everything that's happened in the meantime in terms of geopolitics and world events, to be worrying about sort of a little blow up, in the financial sector.
Yeah, nostalgic. I'm nostalgic about all that stuff. We still functioned as a society even when that was going down. I think the first time I met you was on the financial terrorism tour with Enoch Crane, and that was all talk of the time, was this whole thing of a financial impending implosion. There's people like Matt Kaiser was saying this, and lots of others, and Ireland was being bailed out by the IMF, and it seemed like the end of the world at the time, but it was nothing compared to what we have now. What we have then, I'm nostalgic for it, for what we had back then. At least we had options to do things, and it didn't seem as vicious as it does now.
I know. I mean, what we're going to do today is basically reflect on the alternative media, the alternative scene, and how that has kind of evolved, or maybe devolved over the last 10 years. But no doubt, I think we'll end up reaching back beyond 2012 with some reflections. I think that's inevitable. One thing I wanted to ask you personally, actually, was when and why, because you were one of my early guests, Legalise Freedom, okay, and it was somebody that when I read your book, your material on psychopathy, it was obvious I had to speak to you. But when and why did you first go public, with your thoughts and reflections on the world and what's happening to our species? What was it that you felt? Because I have a very clear story about this. Why did you feel that you had to, go public, basically, and say, look, this is what I think?
Well, I've been always feeling this way, going right back to the 90s. I don't think I never didn't feel this way about it. And I can even remember back in the day reading hackers fanzines and other alternative underground fanzines and listening to people like Lyndon LaRouche. And there was very little on. You'd have like public access TV in America, where I lived at the time, and you'd have sort of strange programming that moved between sort of conspiratorial stuff and Fortean stuff and hacking and the old hacking, the phone hacking thing. And these were a kind of a scene that existed, but I wasn't really part of it. I spoke to some of the hacking guys. I'd met them through the kind of alt scene in New York, which by that time I was very much not really involved in. So there was nothing really out there. And when I came back and I was living here a while, I stumbled across on YouTube. Well, when YouTube first started, it was absolutely loaded with conspiracy theories, videos, and conspiracy theory topics and alt topics. I remember, like, Alex Jones kind of owned YouTube when it first started. He was everywhere and getting phenomenal views. And I can remember this one video called, the guy was called Nuff Said, and came out about 2006, 2007 on YouTube, and it was called Conspiratus Satanicus or something like that. And it was like a 7-part thing. Of course, it was all pulled down eventually because it was all copyright material when Google took over. But the guy had stitched together a lot of the things that I was really into in a very artistic and interesting format using music. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, there's something here. This is something new, and I'd like to be a part of this kind of filmmaking / information sharing. And I didn't really know how to do it because I had Windows Movie Maker, basically. And I made a very early film, kind of drama, which sadly has been lost on the Mothman sightings, in which I did arty effects and tied in the CIA MK Ultra stuff. And it was only about 20 minutes long, but it looked really cool, and I had music that I did myself. And that's when I thought there's a future in this kind of world, not just from a geopolitical conspiracy 40 type way of looking at it, but there's also room for the artist, there's room for the filmmaker. And I have to say that Nuff Said Conspiratus Satanicus was absolutely fantastic at the time. And there was some other guys. There was a guy, a black dude in America, who used to make these short videos. They were always in black and white and slow motion. And he was things that I'd never really heard about, like the conspiracies surrounding the music industry and things like that. And they were just so cool. And I think it was just, I want to be part of this world. I want to be there somehow, but I don't have the technical abilities to make films. So what I can do is I can make YouTube videos talking about psychopathy that I learned about this stuff over the years and relate, and then other subjects as well I spoke about. And I haven't really wavered much. And my first video on UFOs was that it had nothing to do with aliens as far as I was concerned. It was to do with some kind of connection to the subconscious mind, but they do exist. And things like that. I remember I did a very early video on the Fibonacci sequence before a lot of other people. And that's how it really started for me. That's how I dipped in. But I have to say, the stuff that got me in the door wasn't so much like the bread and butter, straightforward stuff like your self-interview shows and Red Ice and Ian Gore Crane. Things like that were at the time were really big. For me, it was very much the more arty end of it, and some of the stuff that was down on. There was a guy called Lennon Honor, another guy in America who did some good work at the time. And this was very early YouTube, and that was it opened up a world for me that I wanted to be a part of. I felt that this was going to be something colossal, and it is in many ways.
Yeah, for me, the going public with it in 2012 was really not a culmination, but a step, I suppose, on a journey that began, back in the 1980s. And we're of a similar kind of age. And I don't know if you had this, but I had this sense from when I was a child. I mean, going back, I can remember a certain moment when I looked at, I was in a social situation, family situation with a mixture of adults and children. And I looked at the adults in the group and thought, there's something wrong with this picture. And I'd always thought there was something wrong with the world. I don't mean that it's, that the earth or incarnating on this plane as a human is bad, but there was something that we were failing to grasp or understand. And when in the 1980s I began to read about, the moon missions, questions around that, alien life, UFOs, what really happened with JFK. We know, was the story always just as straight as it's presented? That was something I think that probably eventually led to me just, having this internal dialogue that I thought, I can't do this anymore, that there's something I want to share with people here. So I don't know, in your case, when you were younger, if you had that sense of like, what I'm being told, it isn't all that there is, or I've got questions here that I'm not being given the answers to. I'm not satisfied with the world as it's been presented to me. I don't know if you had that experience, but for me, it was very, very profound, and it happened maybe age 6 or 7.
Yeah, I was the same, exactly the same. But the thing was with me was, I can remember reading those Eric von Daniken books and those Chariot of the Gods and all, and quite when they came out, I was very, very young. And UFO books and Dennis Wheatley novels and books on magic and stuff. So to me, there was the kind of high strangeness of the paranormal mysteries Fortean world. And then when I grew older, I instinctively knew that the political system or the socio-economic or the real world stuff was also its own kind of high strangeness. But I never saw the two things as being one. You have the social, cultural, economic, political high strangeness on one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you had the paranormal, the Fortean stuff, all that stuff was on that side. But what happened was, and back to the early days of this scene growing, is that people started to merge them together. First, David Icke. Now, he went in there with the whole reptilians thing, which that was his thing. That's okay. That's the way he did it. But it would have been the way I did it. But that's okay. We all do our own different things. But he was touching on something that I think yourself and myself instinctually knew, but either didn't go there or didn't have the language to describe it. That behind all the political stuff, all the socioeconomic stuff, all the religious ideologues, orthodoxies and everything, was something that was somehow related to the Fortean and the paranormal stuff. Therefore, ultimately, I started to feel soon after 9/11, very strongly, 2002, 2003, that we lived in a world that wasn't controlled by the same people we are. And it was more than just the psychopath stuff. It was beyond that. I knew about that stuff. That was already there. That's already well known. But it was something more. There was a spiritual crisis. And it was this active scene, this alternative media scene based around the internet that fused the two things together, often clumsily, often unfortunately through a kind of a Judeo-Christian mindset, biblical apocalyptic mindset, but nonetheless brought the two of them together. And I have to say it was that was the real, the initial ones were small revelations, but that was yes, that's it. There's something like that going on.
Yeah, that's a very important insight, actually, connecting those two worlds, because I think that they were deliberately set apart, portrayed as this is one thing, this is another. And I think that when that insight happened, when you had that moment of revelation, which I had as well, that changed everything really. And 9/11 was an incredibly important turning point, I think, in evolution of human consciousness. And I've spoken about this many, many times. And because I think of myself, my mindset, my worldview prior to 9/11, and I kind of imagine myself as somehow complete in terms of consciousness at that point. But when I look back now, I realize that something shifted. There's no doubt about it. And it doesn't actually matter what you think about the events of 9/11. That's kind of neither here nor there, to be honest. But something definitely shifted. And during my recent interview with Andy Thomas, British author, he was one of my very, very early guests. on legalisefreedom.com. I did an interview with him around 2012, because it was kind of like, and I said to him, well, didn't the whole thing turn out to be a damp squib? And he said, well, yes and no. But he felt that something definitely shifted in human consciousness around 2012. And I think that if you go back to 2001 and the events of 9/11, you can say the same thing. So these are what I call temporal markers in where human consciousness is going.
Yeah, Andy Thomas is right. There's a big yes and no, but the yes is pretty profound. The yes part of that. I think that 9/11 literally disrupted the fabric of reality, that not only, human consciousness ultimately is connected to that, but it absolutely ruptured the fabric of reality. And again, I think it's no coincidence that the All-Seeing came along to fuse all these together. You think on one end of the spectrum, people will be saying things like, well, the socioeconomic system is evil. Here's the reason why. We have Bilderbergs, we have the Trilateral Commission, and all that other stuff, more esoteric Illuminati things coming out. At the same time, you would have other people saying, oh, there's devils and demons and reptilians are behind it all, and shapeshifters and all this stuff. And then you have you consider them the kind of bricks of the actual developing alt media. Then you have people in the middle, like Anthony Peake, who is delving into things like the mysteries of the mind and quantum physics. He was like the mortar. People like him were the mortar that glued the stuff together. And yeah, I think things changed much more for the yes than maybe. I definitely believe that we're living in a different reality, and I know for a fact that even when I look back at photographs that I have or pick things before, even artwork, everything before 9/11, it's all different. It's like even the colors seem different. Reality has been fundamentally changed, and we couldn't have gotten through or been subject to, the last 2 years, the last 2 and a bit years of the lockdowns and all the other stuff that went down, if it hadn't have been for 9/11. 9/11 fractured reality to such a degree that the controllers were then in a position to actually impose these things, knowing that humanity was melting away in some ways. As Alan Moore says, humanity is turning to steam. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think that's why, as time has progressed since that moment to now, people like us are incredibly alienated from mainstream society. As we take part in it, we have to work in it, we have to exist in it. But when we see things like people wearing masks still in cars and how they got away with all that nonsense so easily, that could have only happened if the human consciousness, the collective consciousness, had been turned to some kind of miasma that had no specific focus anymore and only responded to external triggers to the degree it does. It's like beyond Milgram experiment or beyond Pavlovian conditioning. It was like a spiritual fracture that took place in consciousness, and they filled it in with what they wanted.
Yeah, for me, 9/11, looking back, was like some kind of test. Remember catchphrase with Roy Walker, say what you see, And for me...
See what you say.
Yeah. For me, so when I look back on that, when I remember clearly, because I was there watching those. It was after the fact, because by the time I remember the day clearly, but by the time I turned on the TV, it was all over. So what I was watching was replays, and I looked at what was happening to towers, and I'd watched enough programs on TV about sort of architecture and demolitions, and that's controlled demolition. Yeah, that's what it is. It's a controlled demolition. Simple as that. And I'd been and seen a few of these things, actually happening. Because sometimes they'd advertise them, recently here actually in North Yorkshire, they've taken down some of the cooling towers at some of the old fashioned power stations, coal burning. And people were, it's like a day out. Go and watch the cooling towers come down. Boom. Explosives. They fall on their own footprint in less than 10 seconds. So how the fuck did that those towers come down like that in their own footprint in that amount in seconds if it wasn't controlled. So that's, for me, it was obvious. No problem there at all. But there seemed to be something that happened in hoodwinking people, in saying that what you saw is not what happened. And, we could, as you mentioned, we saw this particularly in the last couple of years. There's a reality in front of your eyes. Your five senses are telling you something. You are wrong. And that has a very undermining effect on people's minds, I think, on their own sense of reality and to the extent which they can trust their own senses. And I've said many times, look, in the last couple of years throughout this pandemic thing, if I was going only on the evidence of my own five senses, then there was no pandemic as such. I can't see one. Now, I understand that at the height of it, I wasn't able to tour around hospitals. I wasn't able to travel extensively. I wasn't able to have the full spectrum of experience I would otherwise have had. But, based solely on my own sensory input, nothing actually happened. So to sum up, I just think that playing with people's minds and their own trust in their perception, that has an enormous effect going forward then on how people perceive the next event or the next non-event.
Yeah, I mean, being the person I am, I was less interested in the actual falling of the buildings, although it was all looked very dodgy to me at the time. But the inner Fred Dibnah in me said that looks like it was taken down. At the same time, too, it's funny that Fred Dibnah dies around the same time. I think that was the very first conspiracy theory I ever came up with or thought about, or maybe someone else had mentioned it, around 9/11, was that Fred Dibnah, who could have been all over the TV saying, no way was that taken down by planes, and explaining why. And then suddenly he dies like around the same time, soon after, I believe. And on top of that, now what I'll always remember the one thing, to me, it was, instantaneously, I did a talk at one of the AVs a few years back, and I asked the people, how many people in the audience were overcome by a sense of profound evil when 9/11 happened? And 99% of the audience put their hands up. And there was a sense of profound evil. And that was, to me, that sense of evil alone was enough to convince me that this was a bigger picture than anything we were seeing. And I always remember, and I've always spoken about this, I was coming back home on the train, and all these people, and this is when they still had the old carriages with the tables in the middle. And there was some people in front of me were reading all the tabloids and all the pictures of it. And on the cover of one of the tabloids was the face, like a face of a demon or a devil, a simulacrum formed by the smoke. And it was also filmed. And that show I told you about, Conspiratus Satanicus, by Nuff Said, he actually included that scene. And then somebody talking about the concept of smoke demons and smoke jinns that appear in the smoke and take form. And I was looking at that thing and I was saying, is it that? Probably not. But why does our minds focus in on that? Not just us, the oddballs, but also the mainstream photographers. Yeah, it sells newspapers. Yeah, it looks cool on the front of a newspaper tabloid. But there's also that we connect with that, we hook into that, because we subconsciously know by finding that one particular simulacrum that devilcraft was involved. And I think, like in a metaphoric sense, the evil, to use the full term in the French, was present. And I think that was a huge part of how this scene developed, is that it functioned very powerfully on intuition and noetics. And I think that's what made us avoid being smothered out by the mainstream. The fact that so many people were going along with alt media due to hunches, intuitions, noetics, feelings and insights of something not completely right with the world. And I think that was the fuel that drove shows like your own and others. This notion that, like, it's not just a sense that something isn't wrong. It's really, really wrong. And I could feel it really, really wrong, and I want answers.
It's interesting to think about, now obviously when 9/11 happened, 2001, the internet was already quite well developed. But actually, you know, I work with a lot of young people who are actually were born around that time or not even born then, and they find my reflections on it to be fascinating and or disturbing. But it's interesting, you know, how the internet has developed during that time, and what the internet was prior to that. And when 9/11 came along, I mean, I did have the internet at home, but there wasn't a sudden eruption, as far as I remember, of thoughts about what had just happened in that media domain. And one thing that I find particularly fascinating is thinking about alt media as it was prior to the internet. You mentioned Lyndon LaRouche. I remember him always ragging on the British. It was always every presentation you ever listened to from Lyndon LaRouche was like, the British are behind this, that, the other thing. You know, how things, you look back now, and I think the internet has thrown up a lot of material from, you know, historical material from the pre-internet days, which is really interesting to reflect on. But how that, I don't know if you remember these things at the time, but you mentioned Dan Brown in one of our offline conversations, you know, his most famous for his 2003 book, The Da Vinci Code. But like things that for me that were pivotal, like the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, the 1982 book, the Templar Revelation in 1997, and, you know, the book None Dare Call It Conspiracy, all of these things that were around prior to, you know, the mid to late 90s establishment of the internet. I think a lot of people associate conspiracy theory with the internet, is what I guess what I'm driving at. And there was all this material prior to that, and engaging in that world was such a different experience back then.
Absolutely. In fact, the whole 9/11 thing didn't really take off in the conspiratorial sense until about 2006, 2007. I can remember there was very little of it on the internet and things like Usenet and stuff like that. And when there was anything conspiratorial, it was usually like in white nationalist or neo-Nazi groups blaming, you know, certain groups for it, not the one that's commonly associated with it. But the previous thing was not the same, though. It was just a fleeting interest. It was very politically driven, very politically orientated. It never got beyond, like you said, historical stuff or politics or anything like that. It was the visual imagery on the internet that was the catalyst that really got things going. It's one thing to hear the words. It's one thing to watch a lecture. But when someone can edit a piece of video, add a piece of music, or convey it in a certain way, it almost is like a fertilizer of the consciousness, and then begins the more spectacular dialogue. And that's why I think it didn't really kick off on the internet until, you know, just the start of YouTube, because then people could, rather than saying something, could point to something, could show videos, could talk about things like this. And it wasn't only just 9/11 and that kind of stuff. It was things like health. You had, remember, Leonard Horowitz talking about a lot of stuff we hear about now, the needlecraft and stuff like that. He was talking about way back then. I wouldn't say he was always right, but it was a door that was opening to a Pandora's box. It was all kinds of things. It was all kinds of alternative thinking that was way outside anything the mainstream covered. And that happened at the same time that mainstream television was becoming more and more appalling. It was as if our psychic attenuation was then trimmed towards what alt media was doing. And because we could focus on individual topics, or particular kinds of shows, it like really would it really flourish these things into a new dimension.
Well, you mentioned Leonard Horowitz, who actually I'd forgotten about until you just mentioned. Again, prior to this conversation, we were talking about Alan Watt, who passed away not that long ago, and you did a very nice tribute on your channel, just reflecting on his life and work. And we think even if we talked about David Icke, who, let's face it, got his start around like 89. People think of like Icke as a sort of post 9/11 figure, but he's really not. And it's so interesting to me because for me, Alan Watt was an early experience of a different way of looking at the world, and it's so interesting to look at and listen to the thoughts of these people, whether they're still around or not, going back to pre-internet times. That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalisefreedom.com.
Legalisefreedom.com